for people to join us. If you're joining us tonight, this is for the Marshfield Public Library. It is Putting Your Garden to Bed Tonight, and for our garden gurus presented by the Wood County Master Gardeners. Thanks, and we'll be starting soon. Hello to those who've joined us. Thank you for joining us tonight. We'll give a last couple of minutes waiting for our last time people to join us here for a 6 o'clock start time. Thanks for joining us for the Garden Guru program from the Marshfield Public Library, the Everett Rail Marshfield Public Library. Tonight we'll be talking about tucking your garden in for the winter. So thanks for your patience, and we'll just wait for a couple more people to possibly join us, and we'll get underway. Thanks. All right, I think we could probably get started. Just a few reminders. please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. You can see it if you move your mouse down to it and it says chat. For any technical issues or anything that I could help you with, depending, pertaining to the library as a library representative. But if you use the Q&A feature, that can also be found at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions for our speaker, or things related to this evening's topic, or any gardening question that you have, we'll be answering them at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to enter in those questions as we go tonight, and we'll get those questions answered as best as we can, right, Donna?
Right.
So yeah, tonight's subject is winterizing your yard and garden. I am super excited to learn more about this. So yeah, and I also, in the chat for us panelists in the attendees, there's a link to the Google Drive that has all the documents that Donna will be referring to tonight, plus the slides from tonight's presentation, so you can view it as fast or slow as you want to, and go back and revisit for some more information if you're forgetting what you said. So go ahead and use that link and save that link for future use too. So Donna, thank you so much again for doing this tonight for us. I will open up the floor to you, and I'll take a step back, and thank you so much for telling us how to winterize our gardens tonight.
Okay, I'm Donna Strife. I'm a Wood County Master Gardener Volunteer, and we are sponsoring this program along with the Marshville Public Library on gardening topics. So if you have a future topic that you would like to have covered, you can put that in the chat, and we can pick up on that as we go along or later. And for anybody that's out of our viewing area or immediate area, I would like you to know that we are in Zone 4 gardening here. Although a lot of the things I'm going to talk about tonight will apply to other zones as well, those at areas that have frost or freezing temperatures. Okay, I need to share my screen with you, and we will get started. And turn on my slideshow here. And we're ready. Okay, we're going to talk about winterizing your yard and garden. There are some topics we're going to cover. We're going to talk about what you do for your lawns, your annuals, perennials, vegetable garden beds, bulbs, trees and shrubs, and maintenance tasks related to gardening. This may seem like it's a little bit early to talk about this topic now in the middle of August, but there are some things that you can do right now that will make the rest of your growing season more successful, as well as prepare your plants for the coming colder weather. So that's why I chose to do it this month rather than wait till the middle of September, because at that point we could already have had a frost, or it may be very shortly before we have a frost. So it might be a little late for some of the things we're covering. Okay, just a few things first. In general, plants continue to grow to about 50 degrees. When the temperatures are consistently below that point, most plant growth comes to a halt. Grass, however, will continue to grow to about 34 degrees, and the roots will continue to grow until the ground freezes. So many plants, the roots do continue to grow even after the top of the plant has died. And another, just a general thing, the Weather Service usually gives you a frost or a freeze warning. And if you've covered your garden and you're now on your own, because after they have the first one, and if it gets below the frost or the freezing point, then they don't issue any more warnings. So you're kind of on your own if you brought plants in, or if you covered your garden or things like that. So you're on your own then to determine whether or not it's going to freeze at night. So a little bit about predicting some frost. If the skies are clear and the winds are calm, the dew point is a good estimate of the coldest temperature that will be possible that night. It very rarely gets below the dew point on any given night. You can check your local or national weather sites for dew point data. if there are clouds or there's wind, it's very much harder to predict the lowest temperature. And also remember that if you live in an area that is lower than the surrounding area, you can expect that you will have temperatures a few degrees colder than what's predicted for most of the general area. So those are just a few things to remember in general. So let's go on to lawns. When you're mowing lawns, you should be mowing at least 3 inches high or more until the last mowing in the fall. When you mow for the last time, lower the mower to about 2 to 2.5 inches. This is to reduce the amount of plant material that's going to be flattened in the wintertime, and that will prevent snow mold from growing in the long grass that will die, of course, when it gets cold and freezes. If you're going to aerate your lawn, because it's very compacted, or if you're going to dethatch, if you have more than 1 inch of thatch, this is the best time of the year to do those two things also. The soil will not dry out as much as if you do it in the spring or the summer, and there are fewer weed seeds to start growing in the soil openings that you're going to create when you aerate or dethatch. Aerating improves water and nutrient movement in clay soils, especially if they are compacted by heavy traffic. The aerating should be done to the extent that you have 20 to 40 plugs pulled per square foot. And it's important to use an aerating machine that actually pulls plugs out of the ground, not just one that pokes a hole in the ground, because all you're doing is compacting the dirt around that hole. Leave the plugs on the lawn because they'll break apart, and they'll actually add nutrients to the lawn. And I said only dethatch if there's more than 1 inch of thatch. Rake up what you pull out with a thatching machine and remove from the lawn. You can leave the clippings on the lawn all summer long when you mow. You don't have to remove them. And there's a good reason for that. They actually add up to about 1 fertilizer treatment per year, and it does not contribute to the growth of thatch. Too much water and too much fertilizing does produce a layer of thatch. So to save money and time and energy and all that, you can leave the clippings on unless they are so thick that they block the light. However, if you're mowing regularly and not taking off more than 1/3 of the blade of grass, that should be no problem. Fertilizing. When to fertilize. People can kind of remember the approximate times if you follow the holiday schedule. The minimum application of fertilizer for a lawn should be at least once a year to keep it growing pretty healthy. And the best time to do that is around Halloween, mid to late October. This is one application per year. If you're not doing a lot of watering, if you allow the lawn to go dormant in the summertime when it gets hot and dry, you would want to fertilize it once a year. And this provides nutrients to the roots, which they will use until the ground freezes. And then also the nutrients are there when it starts growing in the spring. If you're going to fertilize 2 times a year, the second application should be around Memorial Day, late May to early June. If you're going to fertilize 3 times a year, add a Labor Day or early September fertilization. And 4 times a year, you would add one around the 4th of July, late June to early July. If you're going to go more than 2 applications per year, you probably are going to need to water the lawn all summer in order to keep it green. Otherwise, the grass is not going to be getting enough water. So also do not apply fertilizers that have weed control, like the weed and feed kind of products. Many fertilizers have these combinations and it's supposed to save you time and everything, but they're not the best to use because the best time for weed control is not the best time to fertilize. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. How much fertilizer to apply? If you're doing a late fall fertilizing, and this is only once a year, you should add about 1 to 1.5 pounds of fertilizer of nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the components of fertilizer. You should add 1.5 pounds about that to 100 square feet. This should be done with a slow release fertilizer, and it should say that on the bag. Do not add if heavy rain is predicted, because all it will do is wash it away and spread it into our streams and lakes and all the places where we don't want it. If you're using a solid fertilizer, granules, you'll want to water it somewhat to help it stay on your lawn and start dissolving. Let's see. So how do you know how much nitrogen is in a bag? Okay, a lawn fertilizer bag always has 3 numbers on it, and you can see where the little green arrow is on the bottom of the screen there. Nitrogen is the first number, phosphorus is the second number, and potassium is the third number. Lawn fertilizers should be high in nitrogen with no phosphorus and a very low amount compared to the amount of nitrogen in it. It should also be slow released. So you multiply the number as a percent. So if you have 29 as your nitrogen number, you multiply that by the pounds that are in the bag. And that tells you how much nitrogen is in the bag. Whoops. I'm going to go back here. Oh, not that far back. One more. Okay, so if you have a 40-pound bag of fertilizer and the number, first number on the bag is 29, it's 29 times 40, and that tells you how many pounds of nitrogen you have in that bag. And then you need to figure out how many square feet you have in your lawn and apply the appropriate amount to like a 100 square foot area. You want to apply so many pounds of fertilizer to that area. Unless you are starting a new lawn, there should be no phosphorus in the fertilizer at all. And let's see, that's about all we need to say about that. There's a lot of publications on the horticulture, UW horticulture site, the Learning Store it's called, that have all kinds of publications on how to do all of this stuff in great detail. I'm going over this kind of fast, but there's articles on there about fertilizing your lawn, when to fertilize it, how to do it, what kind of spreader to use and all that sort of stuff. So I'm just kind of giving you an overview right now. So you will want to check some of those other things if you want more information. If you're going to be treating for weeds, fall is a good time, and around the time of the first frost is probably the best. Most weed chemicals, weed killing chemicals, usually have 2 or 3 ingredients, and you want to make sure that the ingredients are the right ones to treat the weeds that you have in your lawn. So for example, if you look at Creeping Charlie, dicamba is the only ingredient that will really be effective on Creeping Charlie. So if you have a combination of 2,4-D and Mecoprop, but it doesn't have dicamba in it, you spray it on your Creeping Charlie, you're not going to get the Creeping Charlie killed. So you need to look at what kind of weeds are most prominent in your lawn, and then find a weed killer product that has the chemicals in it that will do the most good for your lawn. Creeping Charlie is a common one I get questions about, and the best time to treat that is after the first frost. And this is because the Creeping Charlie starts to take the nutrients from the leaves then and the stems and pull it down into the roots, and it will pull down the weed killer with it, and then it kills the roots. If you spray it like in the middle of summer, all of the nutrients are coming from the roots up to the plant's leaves, and it doesn't do any good to the Creeping Charlie. It might set it back for a little bit, but it's going to come back. You might see a little bit of growth of Creeping Charlie, but that's usually, this is the following spring, that's usually from the seeds that were dropped from the Creeping Charlie the year before. If you have violets in your lawn, Triclopyr is one of the only ones that is minimally effective against violets. Your best bet is probably hand digging. They might be set back by the insecticide, but they have a kind of a waxy coating on the leaves, and that kind of prevents them from absorbing the weed killer when you spray it. And one thing you can do to make that more sticky on the leaves is to put a little bit of dish detergent in with the weed killer solution, and that will help it stick to the leaves a little bit. But because of the big bulb that's on the bottom of a wood violet, it's not usually going to eradicate them entirely. Most of the other weeds, they're common ones. For example, dandelions, there's 3 ingredients that will kill those. Chickweed, again, dicamba is your best bet. Crabgrass is not going to be killed by a weed killer because it is a grass. And so the only way to deal with crabgrass is to apply a pre-emergent herbicide in the spring. And then at this time of the year, when it's starting to put out its seed stalks, you need to, hand pull. If you find it in your lawn before it goes to seed very much, it can produce thousands of seeds from one plant. If you're applying a dry weed killer, you have to water the grass first, and that will make it stick better to the plant leaves. Let's see, dandelions, you might need to do a repeat treatment, a spot treatment, because again, that one has a really tough root and can be very thick and very long, can be like 18 inches long. So if you take off just the top of the dandelion, it's probably going to grow back. If you're using any kind of chemicals on your lawn or garden, always read the entire label when using them before you start doing anything. The label is considered legal law, and you have no recourse if they are not used as directed. Also, be sure to check the label for the weeds that you intend to control, that they are on that list of weeds that are on the label. If you have had grub damage, fall is a good time to apply grub control too, and it should be done by September 15th. Which is one reason why I did this program now, because the next program around, it would almost be too late. So a grub control is only good in through about the middle of September, because after that, when the ground starts getting colder, the grubs go further down in the ground and the insecticide doesn't reach them. So let's go back to our list here. Dealing with leaves on your lawn is the next topic. Leaves can be shredded with your lawnmower when you mow in the fall and left on the lawn as long as the blades of grass are visible. If there are a lot of leaves, they probably need to be raked because you're going to have too thick of a layer of chewed up leaves. The leaves can be piled in the corner of a lot, and they can be allowed to decompose into leaf mold, which is a form of compost. They can be bagged and added to compost piles next summer. You can bag them and use them as insulation around the house foundations in the winter, and then put them in compost piles in the spring and summer. If you want to shred leaves so they pack better in bags, or use the shredded leaves as mulch, you can pile the leaves on your driveway and run over them with your lawnmower to shred them. And then you can use these shredded leaves as mulch around perennials, or you can till them into your garden to decompose over the winter. There's so many ways to use the leaves that fall on your lawn other than to cart them off to the community compost pile. And it's going to save you a lot of time and gas and all that other stuff. So use them where they fall and make use of them as best you can for whatever your situation is on your lot. If you're going to rejuvenate a really poor lawn, fall is a really good time to do seeding too. The soil is still fairly warm. The weed pressure is a little less. There's usually enough rain in the fall that you don't have to water excessively to get the seeds going. And you can do seeding up to about the end of September. Remember, grass continues to grow until almost freezing. Sodding can actually be done into the first couple weeks of October. Wait for at least 3 mowings between treating any newly seeded lawn for weeds, because you will have weeds come up because those seeds are in the soil. So, but wait until you have mowed at least 3 times before you treat the weeds. So we're going to move on to annuals. And these are plants that will die when the frost comes. They don't have a hardy root system and a crown that stays at or below the soil surface that will grow again the following year. So if you want to keep them from an early frost, and particularly if a frost is predicted, and then, you know, for the whole week after that, it's going to be really nice weather and it's not going to freeze again, you might want to keep those perennials around for a little, or the annuals around for a little bit longer and enjoy them until you get a hard freeze. So you will need to cover them, or you can move containers inside a shed or a garage overnight. If you're going to use coverings, a cloth covering is better than a plastic tarp, for instance. The cold is not transferred as readily through cloth. You can also use boxes, pails, special frost blankets, or row covers that you might have had from your garden. Just be sure to anchor down any coverings so they don't blow away. Row covers are kind of convenient, and they're often used in vegetable beds because the air and the water can go through them, so you don't have to take them off every day and then cover again if it's going to freeze a day or 2 later, or frost. So that's one of the advantages of doing those. You can also collect seeds from annuals as long as they are not hybrids, and you can use those seeds next spring. A hybrid is a plant, and it will usually have an F1 after it in a garden catalog or on a seed packet. That means it's a cross between 2 parents, and that child plant will not grow true to what you had this year if you save the seeds. But if you have an open pollinated plant, which means the seeds are okay to use year after year, or if you have plants that usually reseed, but you want to make sure they're going to reseed next year, you can collect some of the seeds in the fall and then spread them around in the spring. Let's see. If some of your plants, even after they're dead, usually self-seed, you might want to leave those plants for a few weeks after they freeze so that their seeds can be distributed before you pull them out. If you do not, or if you do that, then don't till up the area around those plants in the spring or in the fall. Just allow the seeds to fall and grow next spring. You can also take cuttings from annual plants, and that's by taking maybe a 2 to 4 inch piece of a new stem, not an old woody one, but a new stem. And you can place that cutting in water until roots form, or you can dust it with a rooting hormone powder and insert it in wet potting soils, and then put that container inside a loosely covered plastic bag to keep the plant from drying out too much until it grows roots. In general, any plants that were diseased should definitely be removed after a freeze. Diseased plants should not be added to your home compost pile. They can be burned, buried, or disposed of in the trash, depending on your local ordinances. Winter sowing is also a possibility. If you don't have room in your house to start plants inside, you can start them in milk jugs. There's a reference on the reference sheet about winter sowing, but basically you cut around a milk jug and leave a little bit connected. Usually I leave it at the handle sides. You can pick that jug up. You put potting soil in it, sow your seeds, tape it shut again, take the cover off, and set it outside in the snowbank. And that way, when it's time for the seeds to start sprouting in the spring, they'll do that because they're used to having those conditions. This works especially well for perennial plants. If you want to be sure that you want to get new plants next year and you don't want to take a chance that Mother Nature is going to do it by self-seeding in your garden, you can try this once. It's kind of a neat way to do it. And who says you can't grow plants in Wisconsin in the winter? Let's see. I'm trying to catch up with my notes here, make sure I don't miss anything. If you have any healthy plants that just froze because of the temperatures, they can be composted along with tree leaves. Mix the leaves and the dead plants together and add a shovel full of dirt, soil, every little while. And that will start the composting process because the soil has all kinds of beneficial microorganisms in it that start that. Basically, it's a rotting process and breaking down the plants and back down to their basic nutrients that you can use then to the compost for your garden bed in the spring next year. Also, make a note of how your plants did this summer. Do you want to plant the same things in the same places next year? If they didn't do as well as expected, or you didn't like the way it looked this year, what would be possible for next year? And you might want to take a picture now. Just go outside with your cell phone or your camera, take a picture of your flower beds, and then you'll remember when you look at those where you had stuff planted this year and where you might want to make some changes for next year. Let's see. Bringing plants indoors. Sometimes we want to bring some plants indoors, especially those that would freeze. If you're going to do this, you have to kind of do it in the reverse order of hardening off in the spring. You gradually adjust the plant to lower light levels. You might move it to an area where it gets a little more shade or more hours of shade per day. And gradually, get it down so it's in the shade all the time, because shade is even still brighter than what your inside of your house will be in the wintertime. When you do bring them in, isolate them from your regular house plants for a few weeks, because you probably will also be bringing in some kinds of insects with it. It's kind of inevitable because they've lived on your plants all summer. Treat for insects if you need to. It's a good idea when you first bring them in, and maybe every week or so, put them in the bathtub and give them a shower. And that will knock off a lot of insects that may be on them. But you still may have some insects develop. And insecticidal soap is a kind of a good all-around treatment for insects on the inside your house. And again, check that learning store for different kinds of insect pests you might find on different plants. Expect that most of the leaves are probably going to drop off the plant. It doesn't mean that it's dying. It means that it's not getting enough light, and it has to grow new leaves that are thinner and more sensitive to light. It's kind of the opposite of when you harden off your plants in the spring and you want the leaves to develop so that they can stand the harsher conditions outside and the greater sunlight. So the leaves will drop, but they will eventually grow back when the plant gets accustomed to its new situation. Don't fertilize until that new growth starts. The plant's not going to be able to use it. It's just kind of biding its time. In fact, you probably don't have to fertilize at all during the winter, especially if you potted up that plant from outside into new soil when you brought it inside. Later in the winter or early spring, you might see a lot of new growth starting. That's when you could add a dilute solution of fertilizer. And then place the plant in a south-facing area, if you have that in your house, or a west-facing area. or use artificial light, because the plants are still going to be getting far less light in those situations than they did when they were outside. Let's see. Oh, back to insects. Some insects, spider mites in particular, might not show up until the weather gets really cold and your house gets really dry inside, because they're an insect that really likes dry conditions. And if you start having problems with insects, you might have to do several treatments, because they may be coming from eggs in the soil or eggs that are laid on the plants that you're not seeing. So several treatments might be needed. Some special plants, talk about geraniums, can be left in their pots, and you just stop watering them. You allow them to dry out and store them someplace where it's completely dark. And another thing you can do with geraniums is to dig up the plant and hang it upside down with the bare roots showing, or store it in paper bags in a cool basement. You might need to spritz it once in a while to keep it alive, but you don't want it to start growing anything green. In early spring, you can then repot it and cut off any completely brown or dead stems. If the stems are pliable and have green inside, they will resprout. So that's one thing that you can do with geraniums. Some people like to bring those in, or else overwinter them. Okay, on to perennials. If you had problems with diseases or insect pests, you surely need to trim back the foliage and destroy it by burying, burning, or trashing, depending on your local ordinances. If you prune late in the summer, like from now on, that's going to encourage new growth, because we do pruning in order to encourage new growth, or for a plant to fill out, for example. And that new growth might not have a chance to harden completely before it starts getting cold, and then that will die over the winter. So the ends of all these new branches might die. The same goes for fertilizing perennials from now on. Don't fertilize or prune any perennials anymore this fall. You can do it during the winter or in the spring, but not at this time of the year. Early fall is also a good time to divide some perennials, especially if they're spring blooming plants. Again, if you do it early now, by around the 1st of September, the roots will still have a chance to develop and grow into the ground in its new location, and then it will be ready for spring next year. Let's see. Irises, peonies, lilies, those can all be divided in the fall. Peonies might not bloom the year after you divide them. Hostas, daylilies, and ornamental grasses can be divided now or in the spring. One of the things to look for, does your plant need to be divided? Is if the center seems to be dying out. So you kind of, especially grasses, you have a ring of grass, but the center is dead. Or some perennials, the plant kind of just splays open from the middle, or it might have been not blooming as well in the last year or two. If your perennials are healthy, then you have to make a decision. Do you want to cut them down or not? And there's reasons to do both. Some people like the look of a nice tidy garden and want to get all the work done in the fall. And so they are out there, cutting down everything that's dead and, getting rid of it. But there's a good reason not to cut down most of it if it's healthy until the spring. That plant residue helps to insulate the crown of the plant, so less mulch will be needed. Many native species, especially bees, use the stems and the litter around a plant as a sheltered overwintering spot. This is especially important if you have native plants, because the insects have evolved with those plants and they're used to finding those plants and using them as a place to overwinter. If you do cut back the foliage, applying mulch is good, but don't apply it until after Thanksgiving or when the ground has become totally frozen. This allows the ground to freeze before you cover it up, and it also keeps pest animals from making a home in your mulch. Because if you wait that long, they've probably found a place already to hole up for the winter, and they won't be doing it in your mulch. Mulch can be straw, shredded leaves, Christmas tree boughs, compost. Don't use unshredded leaves. Whole leaves will pack down too tightly and actually smother the plant. Mulching is used for insulation, but it's also an important thing to do to prevent freezing and thawing in the winter that can push the plants out of the soil. This is known as frost heave. If you do not cut back the perennials, you can expect that there will be some reseeding the next year. That's good if you want to increase the number of plants you have, bad if you don't like to remove extra plants in the spring. Mulch also limits some of that reseeding. And if you cut everything back, be sure that you mark where the plants were this year so you don't dig them up in the spring accidentally. Some of them take quite a while to emerge in the spring, and you might be anxious to get out there and plant things, and then, oops, I just dug up my perennial. Another reason to leave the seeds on the plants is many birds especially eat those seeds all winter. That's their food. So if you cut down everything, you are, especially native plants, you're going to be eliminating some sources for them for food. Roses are perennial that kind of takes some special care. They should be watered all fall, so they go into the dormant season well watered. Clean up all the leaves around the plant. Many diseases will winter over in the leaves. Protect the graft if it's grafted, and you'll be able to see where that is. It's kind of a bump or a node. Mound soil over the crown, or mulch it well, or cover it with rose cones. And you can do the pruning if it's necessary in the spring. Some people dig a trench and carefully lay the plant down sideways in the trench and then cover it with soil and mulch. If you have shrub roses, they don't need any extra care. So this is just the hybrid type of roses. If your perennials are in containers, like you've got, say, blueberry bush or something like that in a container, or a miniature conifer in a container, you are going to need to move them into an unheated garage, or else bury the entire container in the ground. The soil in that container gets way, way colder than the soil in the ground. And the plant may not survive if it's left above ground or outside in cold temperatures. The frozen soil underneath the snow is considerably warmer. It probably only gets down to about 17 degrees underneath snow cover, whereas the air temperature in the winter can get 20 or 30 below. And so you can see where the soil in the container is going to get much, much colder. So be sure to protect those. Another thing is you could pack a bunch of insulation around the container outside too. That might work also. So on to vegetable gardens. If you still plant really soon now, you maybe be able to get another edible crop of some vegetables, particularly radishes, lettuce, and spinach, and maybe things like kale. So don't give up on gardening, especially if you've pulled out some plants somewhere and you just have bare ground in your garden. Better to cover up that bare ground than to have to weed it later. You have to choose a variety that has short days to maturity, so something with probably 50 days or less maturity. And the soil will be warm and the air temperatures will be cooler for better curing conditions of these plants, because they tend to shoot up and go to seed in the summertime. If you have lots of pepper plants with flowers on them, or tomato plants with flowers on them, or small fruits that will not mature before frost, you can cut off those flowers and the small fruits. And this will encourage the bigger ones that are on the plant to mature faster. Also, pinching out the tips of Brussels sprouts will help the lower sprouts to mature faster. Warm season crops will not survive a frost. So if you have an early frost predicted, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, and cucumbers, you need to cover them to extend the harvest. Cool season crops like lettuce, spinach, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and root crops will take a light frost without damage. In fact, some of those cold crops can go down as low as the mid-20s before they're affected, or even the low 20s for some of them. You want to remove all weeds for two reasons. At this time of the year, they're competition for your crop plants. So they're taking nutrients and water and sunlight and all that stuff away from your peppers and your tomatoes and all those other vegetable things that you're trying to grow. The second reason is if you give up now and say, oh, heck, it's the end of the season, you know, they're just weeds, I'm just going to not bother weeding anymore. If they go to seed, you're going to have a lot more weeds next year. So avoid the competition for your vegetables and also get rid of the weeds for next year by keeping after the weeds in your garden. There's an old saying that 1 year seeding makes for 7 years weeding, and that's true. Not only do the seeds hang around for next year, but some of them can hang around for 10 years or 20 years afterwards. So it's good reason to keep weeding. Remove all vegetation from your garden unless you have, let's say, garlic that's going to be overwintering. Compost the good stuff, destroy anything that's diseased. And some vegetables need curing before they can be stored for the winter, in particular onions, garlic, squashes, those kinds of things. If you want to keep those so they keep best, they should be cured, and that means leaving them in a warm, dry, ventilated area for a couple weeks so that the vegetables develop a good sturdy skin on the outside, and then they will store longer for winter. And then they would need to be stored in your basement or a root cellar or something like that. Let's see. Tomatoes, if you have some that aren't ripe, if they are starting to change color at all, you can pick those and they will ripen indoors. They're ripe, the warmer the temperature where you have them stored, the faster they'll ripen. If you want to keep them from not ripening as soon, you would want to put them in your basement or a cool area. If you want them to ripen sooner, then leave them upstairs where it's going to be warmer. You would want to wash and dry them gently and place them in boxes or trays. Keep them from touching each other to prevent spoilage if it develops. Some people wrap each one individually. That's a little bit of work if you just check them every few days to make sure that anything that's starting to spoil or have soft spots on it, that you get rid of that and take it out of that storage area. Soil protection. Bare soil is not good at any season of the year. It tends to blow away in the winter time, get washed away, especially if the soil is kind of on a slope of any kind. So you want to protect the soil from erosion. You can cover it with shredded leaves or compost. It's another good way to use all those shredded leaves. Or if you have other mulch to use. Some people plant cover crops too, and that's another whole topic that we could get into. You want to consider, if you're going to do that, that the cover crop is planted soon enough that it gets a good head start before it freezes. So if you have bare areas in your garden, you could do that. And the other thing is you want to consider, is this cover crop going to winter over and continue growing next spring, or will it be killed by the frost? Because if it's not killed by the frost, then you'll have to deal with that cover crop in the spring. One of the things you want to do in the fall, about the middle of October, is to plant your garlic for next year. Garlic is planted in the fall, and you want to plant it late enough that it starts growing some roots, but not so soon that it starts growing above the soil surface. So mark it so that you don't till it up in the spring or dig it up. And then next year, about July, you can harvest your garlic. Again, make notes of successes and failures. Note where each vegetable grew if you didn't have a planting plan from the spring. You want to rotate the crops next year. So if you planted tomatoes in a space this year, if you have enough space, you don't want to plant tomatoes there for at least 2 more years. So you would plant maybe beans in there this year, or lettuce or carrots. So you want to rotate the crops. Take note on which varieties grew well. Did you have some that just didn't do well at all? Maybe some that got diseased. For example, if you had a lot of powdery mildew on your squash or cucumbers, you might want to make note that next year you need to look for seeds or plants that are mildew resistant. If you're having a problem with certain kinds of diseases, there are plant varieties that are not as susceptible to get those kinds of things. Also, make a few notes about what the weather was like this year, because sometimes the diseases plants get is pretty dependent on the weather. And so if we had an unusually wet year or an unusually dry year, that could be the main reason why your plant had problems this year. And it wasn't the plant itself, it was just the growing conditions. So that's some things to think about. Bulbs. You would want to plant spring blooming bulbs in October. We're talking about things like tulips and daffodils. Again, you want them in the ground so that they start to form some roots, but you don't want them in the ground so soon that they start to grow the tops above the soil. If you have tender bulbs, those are the summer bulbs like gladiolas and cannas and those kinds of things. You need to dig those up and cure them. And again, curing means just letting them dry out, and then you gently take off some of the dirt, and you can store those in like peat moss or something like that in your basement until it's ready to plant them again next spring. Let's see. If you have trouble with squirrels and moles and that sort of stuff from digging up or eating the bulbs, you can apply a repellent to the bulb, or you can actually make a box out of like chicken wire. So think of, cutting in sort of like an origami box, cut the ends and fold them up so you have a box shape without a cover, and then turn that upside down over the bulbs that you're planting and fill your dirt in, your soil. And the bulbs will grow up through that chicken wire, but the squirrels, when they're digging down, will run into that wire and be discouraged from trying to get at the bulbs. Then water the soil well. Another thing you can do is put a screen on top of the soil after you've planted the bulbs, if you have problems with squirrels and things. After the ground freezes, you want to mulch to keep the soil temperature cold and prevent premature sprouting in warm late summer or late winter weather. So sometimes we get those really early spring warm streaks, and plants kind of think, well, it's time to start growing. And by having it covered with mulch, it's going to keep the grounds cold, so they won't do that. You can also plant bulbs at this time for forcing during the winter. So bringing some of those bulbs inside and planting them in pots, so you have blooms like in February and January. Whoa, we got ahead of ourselves here. Let's go back here. Maintenance tasks. Oh, no, we got to go one more. Trees and shrubs. Okay, trees can be planted up to 6 weeks before the ground freezes. If you plant them, be sure you keep them well watered until the ground freezes. Mulch with 3 to 5 inches of mulch over the root zone, but don't let the mulch touch the bark of the trunk. Mark, if it's the mulch is piled around the trunk, it holds moisture and invites decay and disease. Young trees, you should wrap the trunks of trees to prevent sun scald, especially on the south or the southwest side of the trunk, or you can paint it with 1 part latex paint mixed with 4 parts of water. When you're planting a tree, you want to put 3 stakes around the tree and loosely tie it to the stakes. You want the plant to be able to move some because that's how it develops roots, is by the movement. So you don't want to have it so tightly staked that it doesn't move. You can also plant perennials in the fall, shrubs. And just like with your other plants, do not prune trees or shrubs from this point on now. That's only going to encourage them to put out new growth, which will probably die before the winter is over. If you have trees that are subject to winter burn, you might want to wrap those later in the fall, or put up a snow fence, that type of thing. Trees and shrubs with weak trunks should be wrapped or tied 2/3 of the way up the tree to keep heavy snow and ice from bending or breaking the trunk and the branches. In case we do get ice in the wintertime, leave the ice on the plant. Don't try to knock it off because you're going to probably be doing more damage by trying to knock it off. Just let it melt by itself. And the tree will often go back to its former shape, or you may have to brace it then after that. All trees and shrubs should continue to be watered all fall until the ground freezes, especially evergreens, because they stay green in the wintertime and they actually do some transpiring, or not really growing, but they do some chemical things in the wintertime in the leaves, and they need water for that. And when the ground is frozen, it can't get water. So if it goes into the fall already stressed from lack of water, those evergreens oftentimes die then over the winter. So be sure that they get a lot of water in the fall before the ground freezes. One other thing with critter control, mice are sometimes a problem eating the stems of trees and shrubs. Cut the grass really short around the trunk and or circle the trunk with a fine wire mesh that's sunk into the soil an inch or 2. Another thing is to pack snow very tightly around the trunk to make it harder for the critter to tunnel through, and even add in a little bit of water to make an ice ring around that tree so that the mice and those kinds of things are less likely to make it to the tree trunk. Rabbits are a little bit different. They feed above the snow line. So if you're going to cage or fence something to keep rabbits away from it, it has to be fenced 2 feet higher than the expected snow depth. Otherwise, the rabbit's still going to get to it. The same for deer. All of these things can also be discouraged with a repellent by either by hanging things on the branches or spraying the tree lower branches, or my thing here. Moving away. Spraying with a repellent for those types of animals. As far as the leaves, we kind of talked about that. Bag up those leaves, use them for mulch, all kinds of things that you can do with those, rather than just take them away and put them in the city compost pile, or the city comes and picks up it, or whatever your local ordinance is for. Then there's a few maintenance tasks you want to think about in the fall. If you have containers that you used for plants, you want to clean those out. You can put the soil in your compost pile. You can spread it around your garden. Clean out the container and store it inside, especially concrete or clay containers. They can hold water, and then when that freezes, then the container cracks. So you want to store those inside. Your garden tools should be cleaned of soil. Remove rust with steel wool or sanding paper, and repair them, sharpen them, and apply a light coating of oil with a rag, and then they'll remain rust-free until next growing season. Your mower and other gas-powered tools should be emptied of gas and oil. Clean them, replace filters, sharpen the blades, all that sort of thing, so they're ready. And you won't be bucking up against the many other people who wait till spring to do that. Drain your garden hose and store it someplace where it's not going to freeze. If you have seeds left over, store them in a tightly closed container with a desiccant to keep them dry. An easy one is to wrap a couple tablespoons of dry powdered milk in a paper towel and tie it up with a rubber band and store that with your seeds. Or if you have room in your refrigerator, you can put them in a tightly closed container in your refrigerator over the winter. You want to store them someplace where it's cool and dry. Basements work well too. Many seeds will be viable for 1 to 5 years, depending on the type of seed. So just because you didn't use it all year this year, many of them also carry over. The ones that are less likely to carry over well are corn and onion seeds. So those might be worth investing in new ones. Consider safer de-icing options for your garden and your lawn. Consider calcium magnesium or calcium chloride. Those are easier than plants than sodium chloride, which is regular salt. Shovel before you put the salt on, so you have to use much less, and that will also keep salty snow from being shoveled onto your lawn and into your gardens. Or as an alternative, use kitty litter or sand for traction instead of salting. So those are some things to think about, because that will also affect your garden and your trees and your shrubs if they get a lot of salt over the winter. And as we talked about earlier, make notes for next year. Take a garden walk now. Use your camera on your phone or your camera, and just take pictures of the way everything looks right now. And then it will be easier for you to remember when those tempting garden catalogs, come in January and you see all these nice plants, and remember, oh, everything I have is growing in the shade right now. So a lot of those sun plants aren't going to work. Do some of the plants need to be moved next year in the spring because they didn't do well where they are? That's like, you went out there and found this really neat plant, but it's not doing well where you put it, so you might have to move it to a different place. Are there dead spots where you need more plants? Or are there weeks when nothing is blooming in your gardens? Are the plants too big for their space, or do you need a greater variety of color and texture? Is there an area that didn't do well, or are you having a hard time getting any plants to grow in an area? This would be the time to take a soil test this fall. The labs are much less busy in the fall than they are in the spring. Soil should be tested every 3 to 5 years, or if there are plant problems that you just are having trouble growing something, nothing will grow particularly well in an area. Right now, the lab is right here in Marshfield, located on Yellowstone Drive. It may be moving to Madison in the future, but for right now, it is here. So it's really convenient. Costs, I think, $15 or $20. So it's well worth it that you don't waste that much money on fertilizers and other things trying to fix a problem when you don't know what the problem really is. So I'm going to do this little bit of information that we do every time. If you are looking for information on any issue, gardening, I'm looking usually in particular, when you go on the internet, in the search engine, whatever you're using, enter your question or topic and add the word extension. This brings up tested and proven information from university extension sites all over the United States. And then choose a state near your state or has a similar growing zone or climate. So if you don't find anything from Madison Extension, you might find something from Minnesota or Michigan or Pennsylvania, and these states kind of have the same growing conditions. So so for example, if you said you were having trouble with tomatoes, you would type in tomato diseases extension, and that would bring to the top of your results list all the extension articles. These articles have been tested, they've been proven, they've been researched, and so they're much more reliable than if you just go on and type in tomato diseases and you get who knows who answering your question. You don't know whether they've even ever grown tomatoes. So that's just a little bit of information. I usually try to put an invasive species of the month onto my talks. And this one is Japanese knotweed. It's highly invasive and it's very hard to control. You can see that it can get to be quite tall. The stems look like bamboo and they're hollow inside. You can see in the bottom picture there, someone's holding one that has been split. They look really very tropical. And when they're in flower at this time of the year, this is what they look like in that picture. Can be up to 10 to 12 feet tall. They have kind of heart-shaped leaves. They like moist areas, could be stream edges, roadsides, waste areas. They can send out roots up to 60 feet away from the closest stem, and they can come up through concrete and foundations, as you can see in the picture in the lower left. So it's a very nasty weed. So if you notice any of this, and this would be the time of the year when you might recognize it because of the blooming flowers now. And when it's like just not blooming, you might just think it's a brushy area and it's just, you know, shrubs and young trees or something growing in there. But this time of the year, it's pretty obvious what it is. So with that, I'm going to ask if there are any questions. I'm going to stop my shares. Oh, I guess I can see the chat from here. I don't have to. So let's check the chat here. Anybody have any questions out there?
I think we have quite the quiet crew tonight, Donna.
Yeah. I know I talk fast and I give a lot of information, but you can always go back and listen to it again.
Yeah, that's the really nice thing about them being on YouTube too, that you can always like, oh, what did she say now about doing that?
Yeah.
You?
Any suggestions also for future topics? Our topic next month will be growing and using herbs.
Yeah, super excited about that. And you said you don't need a lot of space to grow the herbs either, so anybody can do it.
Yep.
Yeah,
We'll wait a minute or two. I don't know that we'll have any questions or not.
yeah, I don't see any.
I hope everybody's been having a good gardening year. You've been successful with whatever you decided to grow. Any questions in general about gardens? Doesn't have to be about end of the year gardening. If you do have questions, the Wood County Master Gardener Volunteers does have a website where you can enter questions or leave a message, and we will get back to you in a few days. It's checked at least once a week, sometimes more often. And the Master Gardeners is also present on some weeks at the Farmers Market in Marshfield on Tuesday mornings. And Wisconsin Rapids, I think it's only once a month now. But we also plan to be at the Fall Fest, Maple Fall Fest. So for the plants for sale and to answer gardening questions. So that's another opportunity if you're looking for information.
Sure.
And of course, your county extension office too.
All right. I think that's it for tonight, Donna. We got a quiet
Yeah.
crowd. Well,
Yep,
thank
I'm
you.
done.
Thank you so much again, Donna, for presenting tonight for us. And hopefully people can find lots of good information about tucking their gardens in and getting ready for the winter and start planning for next year.
Yep,
So thanks again so much.
you're welcome.
Oh, you know what? I do have one question.
Oh, I see that too. Native plants not liked by rabbits, deer.
Oh,
That's a good question. Deer will eat almost anything that if they're hungry enough. There is a publication at the Learning Store, or you can check the DNR website. There are some varieties, for example, of trees and shrubs that they don't prefer, I would say. But
sure.
this year, it's been a weird year. I've had them eat the flowers off my hostas, which usually they eat the leaves. They ate all the leaves off my begonia, which they have never touched before. And I've had other people tell me they've eaten things this year that they've never eaten before either. So it's kind of just the luck of the draw. If it depends what the deer in your area have a taste for and how hungry they are. But there are lists on either the DNR website or the Learning Store that would give you some suggestions of ones that they don't really prefer.
How about rabbits?
Pardon?
How about rabbits? Are there any plants for sure that they won't touch other than marigolds? Is it true about marigolds?
Marigolds, because of that strong scent, and they must have a strong taste. That's one plant that usually doesn't get eaten. Many of the native plants, I have a lot of native plants in my yard, and those they don't seem to touch as much. So going native is one way to go, and those plants have evolved with all the critters and everything, so they've kind of, you know, settled their their differences a little bit, and they know how to handle it if they are eaten off.
Sure.
But yeah, I haven't had them eat most of my native plants. It's another good reason to do natives. I hope that answers Barb's question.
All right. I think that's it for tonight. Thank you again, Donna.
You're
And we
welcome.
hope everybody comes on back, and thanks for joining us tonight. And like Donna said, if you have any ideas for programs in the future for Garden Guru or any other ones, let us know here at the library, or type it in one of our messages or chats, or on our Facebook page, or even on our YouTube channel. Different ideas that you'd like us to see to talk about, because we only plan a couple months out in advance, so we can always stick a new thing in. So thank you so much, guys. Have a good night.
Yep. Bye-bye.